That's a very abstract, subjective concept, right? And it shouldn't be confused or conflated with something that is empirically tangible. That is, you can see for yourself. It's black. It's pretty much black and white. It doesn't get any more black and white and binary than. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Alrighty then. So I guess my first ever podcast episode is already underway, and this podcast is so new that I haven't even figured out a name for the series yet, which I will have to eventually work on. In fact, I'll get back to that as soon as I'm done recording this first episode. Anyhow, welcome everyone, and thanks for tuning in. If you are listening to this, that means you have either been following me on Twitter, which is where I first announced I was going to do this podcast series, or that you've been following me on YouTube by the same name, channel name, which is Hazween 23, as my SoundCloud page here. And you've either been following me ever since the beginning, since I joined YouTube, or since I started making videos about my weight loss and fitness transformation. And you saw my most recent video upload, which was basically just sort of an intro test episode for this podcast series. So thanks everyone for dropping by. I guess it's rather redundant for me to say that I'm Hazween. Yeah, I'm going to be the owner and host of this podcast series. So as I mentioned before in my intro video, it was rather a short one. I said that in the future I'm planning to have people join me either as guests, so that I can ask them questions, to be interviewed like a proper podcast show and series, or to have them also co-host with me, and then we can kind of talk about a few things, right? And it's always fun to have an extra person on the side, an extra voice really to lend their thoughts to the discussion. So basically, if you've been following me on Twitter, this is where I am most expressive and vocal about a lot of things. I guess the vast majority of things I do end up tweeting about on Twitter are political, which is kind of not by accident, because that's what I actually do. I teach politics. I'm a lecturer, so that is pretty much what I do professionally. And so, yes, I do tend to kind of fall into the political realm more often than not. But other than that, I am pretty open to speaking on a lot of things. And obviously, the most recent one being health and fitness, which again is something that I'm very passionate about, to the extent that I have dedicated a series on my YouTube channel just for that, just to show you the journey, the transformation that I've been through. So for those of you who don't know, I lost quite a bit of weight. I've lost to date close to 40 kilograms, although this has been fluctuating a little bit in the last maybe month, 2 months or so, because of the, I've added on a little bit of muscle. And then I think I went through a phase where I was kind of not necessarily in a surplus, but I don't know, I might have retained a little bit of water weight. And so I gained weight. Whether it was, what the composition of the weight was is kind of unknown, but I am pretty sure that it has a lot more muscle and water factored into it than fat. I don't think I've put on fat because my clothes fit me better, and people kind of, whenever I feel like I'm in doubt, I get feedback from people saying, oh, you look better than last time I saw you. And so that does give me some good hope that I'm still on the right track, although it's very much possible that a lot of people go through the kind of, a little bit of weight gain in their weight loss journey, and that's fine. I guess I'll probably hit that stage at some point, although I hope I won't, or at least nothing too significant. But that's just, part and parcel of any normal weight loss journey. Anyhow, I was just supposed to kind of tell you a little bit about that, not necessarily make it a point, to talk about on this episode. So if you've been following me on Twitter, you would know that in today's episode, right, this first ever episode of this podcast series, I want to talk about speaking in generalities. So if you look at my recent tweets rather, from today, at least at the time of recording now, according to Malaysian time right now. So from today, I put out a tweet, which was a thread, and I started it off with saying, speaking generalities is helpful as a tool to some extent, but that diminishes very quickly when it is overused to make a meaningful individual assessment of something. So that's one. My second tweet was, when constantly used as an expedient, of which generalizations are, it is solely to the detriment of the discussion and really is just a means to shut down further discussion on the issue, on the matter. Number three, case in point, BMI, since again, coming from my experience of having lost weight and learning these things, BMI, your basal metabolic index, is a good tool to assess an individual's health against the population average. It doesn't, however, give you body composition or determine exact health markers. Number four, for example, bodybuilders fall into the overweight or obese BMI range more often than not, but they're 220 pounds of mostly muscle and 5% body fat. And lastly, that's when I said I will talk more on this, not just limited to BMI and health, in my next and first podcast episode, Generalizations, the smart way of dumbing things down. All right, so this is what this episode's going to be all about. So essentially, I guess I want to start off by kind of breaking down what I mean by generalizations. Okay, what is it really? Is it a concept? Is it a type of argument or a series of arguments to make up an argumentation? What is it exactly? So I'll break it down to you kind of briefly, particularly because it comes naturally to me, because this is kind of the line of work I'm in. Apart from politics, I teach communication subjects as well. So I teach rhetoric. So I feel like there's some social, it's part of my social duty and obligation to kind of explain well, at least to the best of my ability, what this concept is before even deciding to delve into the matter. And then we'll go through some of the instances, okay, or situations where generalities are useful, okay, which was kind of what I touched on a little bit in my in my recent Twitter thread, and when it is absolutely not useful. Okay, so first off, to break it down, simply put, generalities or generalizations, I guess is the more accurate word, is basically it's a form of fallacy, or an expedient, typically used to forward a rather weak or unsound argument. Okay, so in rhetoric, when you are making a case for something, you argue for it, right? You make a position, you put yourself in a position where you make a stand for it, and you have to support that stand. You have to give reasons as to why you say A is A and B is B, and so on, right? So generalizations are just an example of a way to put an argument forward, all right? Make it sound convincing, okay? Make it sound reasonable, okay? Although I would say, in fairness, most generalizations are rather reasonable when used in in the best way, in a beneficial way, yes, it makes a whole lot of sense. But when it is used as a fallacy or as an expedient, they are just the opposite of being reasonable. I wouldn't say to the extent of being unreasonable completely, but definitely unsound in that it lacks the certain validity that is needed to make it concrete, to make the argument bulletproof, concrete, solid, standing on its own, that kind of argument. So that's what it is, to just break it down, put it simply. Generalizations, just like any other fallacies, are typically used to forward a weak and unsound argument. All right. You don't have to be a scholar in critical thinking or philosophy to understand this concept. I think it's pretty easy to understand. I think it's just one of the simplest. It's actually one of the simplest fallacies to understand and experience to understand, really. Especially when I teach my students, I think generalizations don't take up much time for me to teach them, as opposed to some of the other more kind of not necessarily sophisticated, but more kind of complicated and less to spot fallacies. And in fact, this kind of brings me back to my uni days when I was a student and I had to sit for my critical thinking, my philosophy courses. Right. There was a time actually when I failed the whole semester. I had to sit for I think it was 2 papers, and I failed both papers. Or I think I passed the first paper or the second paper, but it wasn't enough, right, to make up for the entire semester. So yeah, I myself, when I was a student, I didn't have the greatest time learning it, or at least I didn't have the highest grades and scores as everyone else. It took me a little while to understand, but after I got over that period, it kind of took me a while to kind of appreciate learning it, because after that, after failing it and then having to just force myself to study it just to pass a paper, obviously you kind of lose your patience, and you lose appreciation for learning it, for valuing what you learn from it. But then it took me a while. I think it was maybe a couple of years before I started my first job after that. It was my master's when I sat for that paper that I failed, and it was a couple of years later than when I had my first job teaching, and that's when it kind of occurred to me that this is such a useful thing to know, especially in my field of work, right? Apart from teaching, I used to be a journalist. So this is something that every journalist should be armed with, to know what fallacies and what expedients are being, put out there, in order for them to stay true to their work, right? Being journalists, you have to be. At least that's what journalism used to stand for. Yeah? You have to be just the messenger. You have to just put out the truth and nothing but the truth, really. Okay, whatever the narrative is, whatever the trend is, the most important thing as a journalist that you can do and you have to do, okay, to preserve your integrity as a journalist is to make sure that the truth stands above all else, right? So for me, the journey to appreciating this discipline, right, this field of area of knowledge in philosophy took me a while, but yes, once I got there, after the several tries and obviously after the failure in uni, I really, I kind of developed a real love for it. All right. And I really do enjoy teaching it and making my students understand. So, yes, generalizations are typically just it's a form of fallacy or expedient used to forward a weak and unsound argument. So before I get on to the actual examples of how they are used as fallacies, let's first talk about how they can actually be useful. All right. Since I kind of touched this a little bit and kind of gave you a teaser into that this is what I was going to talk about in my podcast. Yeah. So how generalizations can be useful? Well, there's quite a number of ways. All right. And the one that I think is most relatable, or at least is what I'm seeing a lot of, is when we see it being used in the gender and sex debate. Now, I guess, there are some of you, I don't know exactly who my listeners are at this point, at least, but I tend to see that people who follow me on social media, whether it's on Twitter, Instagram, they appreciate and they follow me for my outspokenness, that I'm just generally someone who is, just one, tries not to use emotions to forward to forward a position, to forward an argument, and two, just tries to be as rational as she can, right? When it comes to something that is objectively true or false, objectively black and white, I'll stick to that. 1 + 1 = 2, that sort of thing. So in the gender and sex debate, whichever side of the argument you fall in, right? I think there's always this opportunity to either, one, use generalizations to your advantage, and in a way kind of abuse it, and then use it as an expedient, or two, use it to try and give a broad picture of what things are, okay, based on statistics. Probably I'll get into the specifics in a little bit, but just to say that there are two ways you can go about it and use generalizations in the gender and sex debate. So first off, typically the liberal lefties, they would say that you have quite a few variations on this. So some of them would say that gender and sex are not the same thing, that one is biological and the other is a social construct, which in all fairness is rather acceptable. If I think, me being a rational person, to understand the where they're coming from, yes, I think that's completely something you can accept. I wouldn't agree with it though, because to me they are one of the same, really. And you can use it interchangeably. Sometimes when you fill out forms, they either put down gender or sex, right? But we all know that it means that whether it's asking whether you're male or female. So okay, so regardless of the variations that you have coming from that end of the argument, the people who believe that for instance, when they say that gender is fluid, or at least they try to justify that trans people are, if they want to say that, sometimes you come across this a lot, like when you say that a trans man or a trans woman is not a woman, right? The most recent example I can think of, and that I kind of spoke up on, was Laurel Hubbard. Yeah, the first trans woman who competed. I think it was, did he make the Olympics, or she rather, I guess, if that's what she identifies as now. I think she competed at the recent Olympics for New Zealand. All right. Or at least I think she qualified for the Olympics. I don't know, but she definitely didn't get through to the final rounds. I think she kind of lost in, she kind of was out of the draw pretty early on. But anyhow, she made it to the women's team, the women's weightlifting team, for New Zealand, and to compete at the recent Tokyo Olympics. So to say that she is a human female, objectively say that she's a human female, I think is absolutely false, categorically false. Yeah. More so that he or she, this is the thing with this debate. I want to stay true to my my argument and kind of my thought process, but at the same time, you get people who are so easily offended just because you don't get their pronouns right. So now that I've kind of clarified that, I guess I'll just stick to what is the popularly accepted pronoun for Laurel Hubbard, since she legally now identifies as a woman, right? So I'll stick to she. So she, and this is how it doesn't make sense for me, because she made the full transition to being a female only just recently, as an adult male, right? So she had gone through puberty as an adult male and only recently made the transition to being female, meaning she had already had fully developed male genitalia and so on. So just to give you an idea of how extreme that discussion can get, right? Literally, with just the data and the facts that we're presented with, someone like Laurel Hubbard, who was just previously male, an adult male, then identifies as a woman, transitions as a woman, fully transitions as a woman, because she went through the so-called, necessary transitioning protocols. All right, she was on hormone treatment and so on, and this was just recent. And then suddenly identifies as a woman, legally as a woman, and competed in the women's weightlifting category. Now, whether or not she won and that there were other women stronger than her, that's not the point. The point is that she was just recently a male adult, right? She has been living the majority of her life, the better part of her life, as a male adult, a biologically, scientifically, logically a male adult with male genitalia and reproductive system, and only until recently went through the transition and was legally able to identify and compete as a woman. So that is just how extreme it is. And to say that, therefore, okay, just because legally she has identified as a woman because she's gone through ABC protocols to transition, that therefore she is objectively and categorically female, I think is completely dishonest, disingenuous, and does nothing to do with, with being helpful at all. Whether that's for women, I think it's to the detriment of women. And I myself, as a, whether you want to call it a cis woman or, woman, just woman in general, really, I don't find that helpful at all in the kind of in the case of fighting for women's rights, especially in sports, right? So the reason why I brought that up is, number one, that is the typical argument used by liberal lefties on that side of that debate, to make the case for transgender people in saying that they can just identify as the gender they wish to transition to, regardless of the context, regardless of whether it has much to do with a social construct, or that it is actually a lot to do with their biological standing. And, in the case of Laurel Hubbard, who was competing at the Olympics, at a major world sporting event, right? I think is just it's crazy, the far ends of this debate that we've gone to in order to accommodate this kind of, and I'll just honestly I'll just put it out there really bluntly, how much we have given in and indulged into this kind of delusion. This is all delusional. Yeah, the fact that we are making accommodations for this, and they're not even like they're not even a big percentage. They don't even represent the majority of the population. Not at least, actual biologically functioning females. And I'm sorry if that does offend anyone, but as I said, I want to stay true to my thought process, to my thinking, and this is me just being expressive, all right, and me trying to stick to the facts, really trying to stick to the real black and white stuff, okay, before we actually get to whatever side of or conclusion we fall on this debate. So that's their thinking, right? And they use that to forward their arguments and their inclinations and whatnot. Okay, so the thing is that while they use that, all right, what they're not aware of is, the kind of abstract notions, and how problematic it is to then use that rather very subjective way of how they feel, like they feel masculine. This is usually how they come up with their arguments. They say that individuals are different, and which of course, as someone who's individualistic, as someone who values their civil, their individual civil liberties and so on, as a libertarian myself, I guess I kind of label myself that way. Yes, everyone is different, but then to kind of paint a very subjective, abstract notion of, concept of feeling, emotions, and then say that's empirically and objectively the truth. It's like, it's like you walk in with a white colored shirt on, and you want to force people to say that is blue, right? Which of course you can see for yourself is objectively false. You can say for sure, and I wouldn't stop you from saying it, you can say that even though I'm wearing this white shirt, it feels like I'm wearing a different colored shirt. It feels like I'm wearing black or gray or whatever. That's entirely your entitlement. That's, you are very much entitled to that. But to force people to indulge your that thinking, I think that is, it's like the opposite of actually being liberal and being accommodating. It's actually this groupthink that is forcing. It's a collectivist approach to things, and more often than not can lead to, as history has shown, can lead to some sort of authoritarianism. But anyhow, coming back to the idea of how this is related to how generalizations are used and can be useful, is that when you, on the other side of the argument, like myself, okay, when we try to counter that that idea, okay, and that argument, we basically break it down as this. This is when generalities are useful. The fact that people can just feel like their gender is fluid and that they can be male. Literally, they can say that they can change their gender from being male and female on a daily basis. That is just untrue. Based on their emotions, okay? As I said, that feeling, the emotions, that's a very abstract, subjective concept, right? And it shouldn't be confused or conflated with something that is empirically tangible. That is, you can see for yourself. It's black. It's pretty much black and white. It doesn't get any more black and white and binary than the two genders that we have. As they say, if I had a dollar for every sex or gender in this world, I'd have $2. So that's literally how black and white it gets, right? So in this way, when you're trying to explain to them, okay, the way you feel doesn't determine what gender or sex you are on a daily basis, rather it is the biological features that determine that. All right. And then they say, oh, but what about intersex? And this is the usual kind of comeback they'll come up with. All right. And they'll say, oh, what about intersex people? Hermaphrodites, basically. All right. When they have more than one genitalia. Are you, who are you? Are you the arbiter of who's, what people's genders are and what sex they should feel like they should be or identify with? Well, for one, and this is where generalities are useful. Hermaphrodites or intersex people, I think the more kind of PC word term is intersex people. They are the outliers. They are the exception to the rule. Okay? In general, humans, and not just humans, but all living animals, okay? We all have only two sets of genders, or two sets of genitalia and reproductive systems. That is how it's been since the beginning of time. That's how we've been able to reproduce and continue the species. All species, not just human species, but all animal species have been able to procreate and reproduce generations from thousands of years, millions of years ago to now. All right, because we have had two sets of sexes and male and female that is basically made up of male and female, and these small minority, again, the keyword here is small, and minority population, percentage of the population who are not that, are the outliers. All right, they are the exception. The same way that people who are born with other deformities are outliers and the exception to the rule. I mean, if you have an extra thumb or toe, it doesn't mean that you're not human. All right. People who are intersex, that are born with both forms of genitalia, doesn't mean that they they can change gender or they are gender fluid. Most cases actually present with one more dominant feature, whether it's male or female, than the other. Okay, in some cases, some of them have a more fully formed or larger penis or clitoris. So unusually they kind of go towards the way whichever is more dominant, right? So that usually determines what sex they are. Although that is, again, separate from how they would feel. Which, again, this is why, it is crazy to indulge this kind of thinking, because they conflate these two things as being one, or just the one. They think that the way you feel one day can determine what you objectively are, which is just completely false, right? So this is one way, I guess, generalities can be a useful tool to really lay out, the basic rules that if you are human, if you are a living animal, you can either have a male reproductive system and genitalia, or female. That's pretty much it. And it is a useful guide, a useful tool to follow this generalization. And I think that's one way that, of course, this is helpful. So that's one way. Another example is, obviously, we use generalizations in society, to set benchmarks and standards in order to allow people in communities and societies to function well. All right, to somewhat have a predicted outcome, okay, an expected and predicted outcome, to make sure that people behave a certain way. Not that, that people should all kind of be collectivists, which I just kind of criticized just a few seconds ago, but in a way that can make or persuade and give incentive for people to behave in a certain way, so that we can all kind of live and coexist in harmony, okay, which is generally what the goal of most civilized societies are. Okay, so we use generalizations to set policies and rules and so on. All right. So this is not to be confused with like the legal system. All right. Whilst laws are in place based on some general expectations of society and people, the interpretation of law isn't, and it really shouldn't be based on generalizations, which is why the legislative branch, is and should be separate from the judiciary. All right, as every legal case should be read and determined and judged based on solid evidence in order to charge or convict someone, especially if it's a criminal conviction. All right, that is, to me, that is just a very rational way of putting it. All right, to differentiate between, which is why, again, we have the separation of powers, because we want to ensure that everyone who is put through the legal system, all right, is evaluated, is judged fairly. Okay. Number 3, generalities are useful and a good tool to be used as a point of reference, particularly in history, an occurrence or incidents that we can study and learn from. Obviously, as a lecturer, this is something that I do all the time. I reference past events, okay, especially political events, political occurrences and episodes and whatnot, wars, the formation of nation states and how governments were built, nations were built, societies were, and civilizations were built, or the opposite, how governments were toppled and civilizations were destroyed and so on. So generalities are a good way of referencing something that has happened in the past to learn from. Okay. And number 4, which is probably the most common, to use generalities from as a result, okay, and then use it as a tool as a result of distribution of data, okay, studying the pattern of numbers, statistics, which literally is what maths is just using a pattern of separate incidences, all right, to then, put it together and see if it, how can we predict this? How can we predict the outcome of these pattern of numbers? That's literally what maths is, right? And that is why we have, specifically in maths, we have probability and statistics, for things like when you want to assess risk and so on, which I guess specifically is not something we have paid much attention to ever since this whole, excuse me, ever since the whole vaccine rollout started. I mean, the one just glaring thing that I just can't get over is the fact that we, not we, but the governments, the people in power, authorities worldwide can say that it is absolutely okay to give out, this mass of immunization vaccine rollout, regardless of your individual health risks and assessment. I mean, that is just crazy. That is, to me, the craziest thing, when statistically and based on probability, there are different sets of risk factors for the different age groups and demographics in society. We all know how the disease affects different age groups and how deadly or much less deadly it is for the different age groups. Okay, particularly when you go below, you go down, that scale, and even further up that scale, the survivability of the disease is still very, very high, right? Which again calls into question, why the push for this, the mandates worldwide. Okay, it's almost as if maths and probability and statistics doesn't matter anymore. All right, but it's just getting the jab in people. More jabs, more fun, I guess. Anyway, but that's just, for me, that is a very useful tool. Apparently not for the people in power today, but that's a very useful tool of assessing and understanding risks, and what you should do from that information. What is then the action, that the next course of actions that you need to take after understanding and processing that, the information that you have, okay, the data that you have. So I would say that, as to start off with, generalities are not inherently bad. All right, and I've just proven to you. I've just given you various examples, 4 to be precise, where generalities can be very useful. Now, it's not useful, and this is when generalities are used to expedite, all right, an argument that is weak, all right, as an expedient, or a fallacy, basically, that is unreasonable and unsound. Okay, so it is not useful for, number 1, making an individual assessment about something or someone. And this is why I use that BMI example in my tweet, in my recent thread, saying that while, yes, BMI is a good tool of assessing your kind of general health, all right, against the average, the population average, it's not going to give you an exact indication of what how healthy you are inside, because it doesn't give you your body composition, which I would argue is a lot more accurate and reliable, because you can be at a healthy BMI, within a healthy BMI range, but if you are a lot of fat, meaning if your fat percentage is high or higher than 30% for both female and male, you're considered obese. Okay. And, you might have a pretty normal ranging BMI in that case. Even if your body fat range wasn't all the way up to 30%, we still wouldn't know your individual health markers. What are the what are your inflammatory markers like? Are you inflamed in this way or that way? Are you susceptible to inflammatory diseases like diabetes and so on? You wouldn't know that just from the BMI, but it is still a useful tool, kind of on the surface. But in most cases, I wouldn't say in most cases, but in more than just some cases, it is a lot more useful to go beyond that. And that's when I said, I gave you the example of bodybuilders having 5% body fat, but, weighing 220 pounds. Okay. Some bodybuilders are like 5'6", which is about my height. And these are men, right? Men who are about my height, 5'6", they're bodybuilders, 220 pounds, just solid muscle, 5% body fat. Their BMI would be within the obese range. But obviously, just looking at them, that they are just 220 pounds of mostly muscle, right? So this is why it's more useful to then go beyond that, to then make a much more accurate and precise evaluation of that situation, to have more context to it, right? And I think in general, like for me, when it comes to health, especially having gone through my my weight loss journey, this is something that I really, really want to stress. And this is something that I kind of just stress on most of the time. I tell and I kind of preach this to everyone, to people who follow me. Not everyone is going to be the same. Of course, we all know with weight loss, it comes down to being in a calorie deficit. But what that number is shouldn't be generalized at all. In fact, I think it's absolutely wrong to just generalize. Oh, okay, for men, it's this is the number of calories that you should consume, because this is typically what you get, right? From how when things are so simplified and you get these very simple talking points, especially people who are on social media, these influencers, these fitness people on social media, because one, I guess the appeal to that is they get more it's easier to get a following. It's easier to get more people to kind of watch their stuff when you simplify it down, all right? But the thing is that what they don't realize is that in the long run, the damage is far more damaging and harmful, really, rather than actually them setting out to help, people struggling with weight, So I think it's just better to just start giving out the message right from the beginning. And there are people who I myself follow, who preach this, who talk about, having to go on this journey and really learning what's best for you, going through, like, for example, just, not calorie intake, but also in terms of your exercise routine, the diets that you should go for. All of that is something that you should go through yourself. Of course, it's very useful to go by the standard set, the generalization set. Like, for example, we all know, like I just said, losing weight, you have to be in a calorie deficit. But then how much of a deficit, okay? Or where do you begin, your weight loss at what calorie consumption should that be? Okay, what caloric value of your calorie intake should that be, if that makes sense, right? So this is me speaking from experience. This is where it is even more important to make a further individualized assessment on something, to really further evaluate something beyond the generalities. Okay. Number 2, when it's not useful to make a generalization, that is to pass off professional or legal advice. Same thing when it comes to these jabs. If you think that the jabs are good for you, for one person, it doesn't mean that it's good for everyone else, right? Since when have we mass rolled out medical treatment invasive medical. That's literally what it is. These are invasive medical interventions to just the massive population outright. We've always made individual medical assessments for each person, and the advice was always to get your doctor's advice, to get consultation from your GP before you proceed with a medical treatment. But somehow, magically, poof, that has just disappeared. That whole kind of thought process going into that. Well, I mean, I guess you can argue that I myself am not a professional, so I guess in some way this is ironic that I'm talking about it. But you can look and compare other mass vaccination programs that we've had in history, and you can look and compare to other vaccination rollouts and the actual percentage of how we evaluate efficacy and the success of a rollout based on actual immunity acquired after having getting the jab, which is unfortunately not what I can say for this current one. Anyways, I don't really want to belabor on that because that is something I've talked about quite excessively. I think pretty much the point of ad nauseum. I was on a call with a friend, and she's basically on the other side of that argument. It was kind of difficult, really, because I haven't spoken to her in quite a while, so we had a bit of catching up to do, and I just had to start the conversation with my stance on that, right, on the vaccines and COVID. It's not always the best conversation starter, never has been, but it just, I had to, and it was difficult. Like, it was difficult for me to at least get her to see where I'm coming from. But I would say I'll give credit where credit is due. I'll say that, she at least can say that, well, that's that's your side of the argument, and I think it's best that we agree to disagree. And at least, she's okay with people having some form of choice. But I don't think she's particularly happy with the fact that some people choose not to be vaccinated because that they've made a risk assessment. But otherwise, at least she's not forcing it on me. Okay, so that is number 2. Number 3, making a conclusive statement on something that is still in progress or being researched. Again, with the vaccine rollouts. I really can't think of any other more contemporary or more relevant example, really, when we're talking about generalities here. Because it can go both ways, right? You can talk about generalities when it comes to the COVID, the disease itself, and how it spreads and the risks for the different age groups. And then you've got the vaccines, the supposed cure, or the supposed only way out of the pandemic. And I can't tell you enough how annoying that phrase has become. And number 4, okay, before I close out this discussion, generalities are not useful for when you try and make a conclusive statement on something that is still being progressed and being researched and continue to be ignorant, okay, even if there is substantial evidence to counter that. Case in point, adverse effects. However rare, that's what they claim though. However rare, I don't care whether it's, you can say that it's every 1 in every 1,000 jabs, 1 in every 1,000,000 jabs. It's still happening. Okay. They say it's rare, but I keep coming across them pretty frequently now recently. As of late, it's becoming more frequent, the cases that I'm hearing of. They say, those people who kind of brush it off, or at least, say, oh, it's not that big a deal because it's this percentage. Well, when I say that I come across it, here and here, they say, well, do you really believe that? Because it's not out in the main, it's not out on BBC, or it's not, CNN isn't saying it. See, that's the problem. If by now they haven't realized that the media is so intertwined, with the powers that be in this whole pandemic, then that, to me, if I kind of make my decision based on that. I feel like if they haven't at least tried to acknowledge the fact that we have a very biased media out there, and to and be and try to kind of make the effort to see, to research the data, to see the evidence that where I'm getting my data from. I feel like if they can't even do that, they can't even as much as try and do that to at least validate my points, and also to at least challenge their position on that. It's really not worth continuing the discussion with these people. Seriously, it's just going to be a waste of time, and you're both going to get frustrated. And especially, I think, if these people are still in any way valuable to you, whether as a friend or a family member or even a spouse, which I'm very sorry for if you are in a position where you have a partner and you have, you are on opposite sides of this. It's kind of difficult, really, because this touches pretty much your all aspects of life, because you're talking here, people who are pro the mandates and basically want everyone to be jabbed. They're implicitly, being okay with the fact that it's fine to just then eliminate the class of people. Literally now we're being classed into unjabbed and jabbed, right? So it's okay to eliminate and to kind of take them out of society completely, because they are the argument for that is predicated on the premise that because they're deemed unhealthy and they are a threat to everyone else, that is why we should remove their freedoms. They should not participate in society, which has always been the slippery slope, the beginnings of much dangerous and terrible authoritarian outcomes and rulers. It's like no one has ever learned from history. So there you go, guys. That's a little bit about generalities. I explained to you what they are. Okay. And I went through with you guys, one, how they can be useful. There were 4 of them. And then the 4 instances when they are not useful, which I've just rounded up with you guys. So that's pretty much it. That pretty much wraps up this episode. Okay, this first one. And I hope you found it useful. Okay, still kind of figuring out what I should talk about in my next one. I hope by then, I think I promised you guys, right? So I should by then have had a name for this podcast series. So yeah, I will have a name for the series, and I'll come up with try to at least come up with a good discussion for my second episode. Again, thank you guys for tuning in. If there's anything you want me to talk about, discuss, and bring up on the podcast, any of my upcoming podcast episodes, please feel free to get in touch. DM me. I am on Twitter like 90% of the time, so you can always reach out to me on Twitter. My handle is Hazween_Sharina. That's my original handle, but you can just find me by typing in Hazween Hassan, and that is also my Instagram handle. You can reach me there, but otherwise I'm always going to be here on SoundCloud. My handle is Hazween23, same as my YouTube channel, Hazween23. Either way, reach me out on these big platforms, these social media platforms. I'm public on all of them, and I will be more than happy to answer your questions and to engage with you. Again, thank you so much for listening. I'll see you. We'll meet again. Not necessarily see, because I'm so used to doing YouTube videos, right? So I will. You'll hear from me. Okay. Hopefully you'll be listening to me again. in my next podcast episode. See you guys.